The room was eerily quiet, except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan. I sat on the couch, heart racing as I stared at the screen in front of me, fingers trembling ever so slightly. A cold sweat began to form on the back of my neck, and despite the warmth of the room, a shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I couldn't control. My mind raced, guilt and fear swirling together, creating a storm that clouded my judgment. What if he finds out? The thought haunted me, replaying over and over like an endless loop. I had kept this secret for months, hiding behind the false reassurance that no one would ever suspect. But deep down, I knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. The environment around me mirrored my anxiety. The dim light filtering through the blinds cast long, jagged shadows across the walls. The ticking of the clock was the loudest sound in the room, its rhythmic beat almost mocking the silence. I could feel the tension tightening in my chest with every passing second. What if he walks in now? I tried to focus on the screen in front of me, but my thoughts kept drifting back to my son. He had been out with his friends, but I wasn't sure how long he'd be gone. A part of me wanted to stop, wanted to turn off the computer, to run away from this temptation. But another part, a darker part, urged me to continue. Just one more time. But that thought only intensified the guilt. Would I regret this? Or would it haunt me forever? The answer seemed too far out of reach, hidden beneath the weight of my own decisions. My son, Ben, was the person who always made me feel safe. He had an innocence about him, a trust that ran so deep it was almost suffocating at times. The way he looked at me, with a quiet admiration that made me want to protect him from everything, especially my own mistakes. At least, that's how I had always seen him until that afternoon. The small, unspoken tension between us had started to grow lately, and I could feel it every time he looked at me with those questioning eyes, wondering why I wasn't quite the same. Ben's father, Robert, had been distant for years, both physically and emotionally. It was hard to even remember the last time we had a real conversation. That had left me alone with my thoughts, and that's when I started to let myself slip, letting my emotions and desires take control, even if just for a few fleeting moments. Robert had once been the person I trusted most, but over time, I found myself growing numb to him. There was nothing left to hold on to, nothing to keep the pieces of our relationship from scattering. Yet, I still stayed, for Ben, for the family I had promised to keep intact. But Ben, his vulnerability was something I couldn't ignore. The way his small hands brushed away his hair when he was nervous, or how he would nervously adjust his glasses when I asked him a question that cut too close to the truth. His silence spoke louder than words. I could feel the weight of it in the room, every time we lingered in that uncomfortable quiet, each of us afraid to speak the unspoken. It was after dinner one evening when I caught him staring at me a little too long. His gaze was almost accusatory, though he said nothing. The way his lips pressed together, a mixture of confusion and concern, made my heart ache. I wanted to tell him everything, but I couldn't. Instead, I brushed my fingers through his hair, as if that simple gesture could wash away the growing divide between us. Could he know? I wanted to reach out to him, but my fear of hurting him held me back. The unspoken bond between us, mother and son, was fragile now, like a thread stretched too thin, barely holding on. Every touch, every glance, felt charged with unspoken tension. I was the one creating this distance, and it made my chest tighten with guilt. Would I ever be able to fix this? Or would he eventually see the cracks I'd worked so hard to hide? The following days only deepened the emotional tension between Ben and me. Every time I saw him, it was as though there was an invisible wall between us. A wall that neither of us wanted to acknowledge, but both could feel growing taller with each passing moment. It wasn't just the long silences that made the air thick with discomfort. It was the way Ben started to avoid my gaze, as if he was afraid to see something he didn't want to know. I couldn't blame him. I felt the same way. But the truth was, I had started to doubt myself, too. One evening, after dinner, I stood by the kitchen counter, absently washing the dishes, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my chest. Ben walked in quietly, as though trying not to disturb me. He wasn't himself. There was a heaviness in his posture, a reluctance in his movements. I glanced at him, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. It was a look that lingered, longer than it should have. His eyes weren't accusing, but they were full of questions, things he couldn't ask, things I didn't know how to answer. I quickly turned my focus back to the dishes, trying to hide the tremor in my hands. Ben didn't say a word. He simply stood there, his presence heavy in the room, as if he was waiting for me to say something, anything. His silence was louder than words ever could be. He took a step closer, and his hand brushed against mine. It wasn't intentional, just a fleeting touch, but it sent a shock through me. I felt the heat of his skin, the softness of his touch, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't a touch filled with desire, it was a touch of care, of seeking comfort in the midst of something uncertain. His fingers lingered just a moment too long before he pulled away, his eyes darting to the floor. I wanted to reach out to him, to say something, but the weight of the moment kept me frozen. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I could feel the distance between us, even though he was standing right there. It was the kind of silence that spoke of lost trust, of things unspoken but understood. I didn't know whether to speak or remain quiet. Part of me wanted to explain everything to him, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. How could I ever find the words to make him understand? Ben shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He was torn, I could tell. There was a part of him that wanted to break through the silence, to confront the unspoken tension, but another part of him seemed afraid to push too far. He looked at me once more, his eyes searching for an answer I couldn't give him. I felt my own hesitation, a hesitation I hadn't known I was capable of. The confusion in his eyes mirrored my own internal turmoil. I wanted to be the mother he needed, the one who would always protect him, but the weight of my choices was crushing. Could he ever forgive me if he knew? Would I even be able to forgive myself? And in that moment, I felt the gravity of everything we hadn't said, everything we were too afraid to acknowledge. The moment everything had been building toward finally arrived one night, when the silence between us felt unbearable, as though the air itself was charged with unspoken emotions. It happened without warning, as if something inside both of us had finally snapped, letting go of the restraint we had both been clinging to. Ben stood near me, as if rooted to the spot, his gaze lingering on me with a quiet intensity that seemed to draw us closer. Neither of us spoke, but the distance between us felt impossible to bridge. Then, slowly, he took a step forward. My breath caught in my throat, the anticipation hanging thick in the air. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I held my breath, waiting. And then, with a gentleness that contrasted with the storm of emotions swirling within us, he reached out and placed his hand on my cheek. The warmth of his skin, so familiar yet so foreign in this moment, sent a tremor through me. His thumb gently brushed against my skin, as if he were memorizing the contours of my face. I closed my eyes for a moment, leaning into the touch, feeling the tension of everything between us start to unravel. Our foreheads touched softly, the intimacy of the moment not lost on either of us. His eyes met mine, searching, uncertain, but full of something else, something I couldn't name, yet understood completely. I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. In that shared space, in that shared moment, everything else faded away. It was as if time stopped, the world outside no longer existed. It was just us, two souls who had been holding back for far too long. Without thinking, I reached up and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, but as the tension melted away, the kiss deepened, becoming more desperate, more urgent. It was not just a kiss, it was a release, a surrender to everything we had been feeling but couldn't express. It was the culmination of every moment of hesitation, every shared glance, every unspoken word. His hand slid down my back, pulling me closer, as if trying to erase the distance between us completely. His touch was delicate yet firm, tracing the lines of my body as though he was learning me all over again. My hands found their way to his shoulders, the muscles tense beneath my fingertips as if he, too, was trying to hold on to this fleeting moment. Our breaths came in ragged gasps as we slowly pulled away, but the connection remained. For a brief moment, we both stood there, forehead to forehead, exchanging a look that said everything. The quiet, whispered words we couldn't speak aloud echoed in the space between us. No more walls. No more hesitation. "I've been so afraid," he murmured, voice barely audible, his breath warm against my skin. And in that soft exchange, all the weight we'd carried was shared. For the first time in a long time, we both let go. As the moments passed after the kiss, the air between us was different, lighter, but also heavier in its own way. Ben and I stood in silence, our emotions tangled up in ways neither of us could have predicted. There was no turning back now. The truth of what we had shared hung between us, raw and vulnerable. I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, but it wasn't suffocating. It was liberating. At least, for now. But as I looked at him, I couldn't help but wonder if this was really what I had wanted. Was this fleeting moment of release worth the uncertainty that would follow? His face mirrored my thoughts, torn between something beautiful and something we couldn't fully understand. In the quiet aftermath, Ben finally broke the silence. His voice, softer than I'd ever heard it before, trembled slightly. "I don't know what to do with all this," he said, running a hand through his hair. "It feels like we've crossed a line, one we can't uncross." His words echoed in my mind, and I realized he was right. There was no going back to how things were. The space we had once occupied of trust, of family, had shifted into something unknown, and that scared me. But as I stood there, looking at him, I knew that this change was inevitable. We had both been holding on to something, pretending that things were okay when they weren't. "Me neither," I whispered back, my voice barely audible. But deep down, I felt a flicker of clarity. We had crossed that line, but maybe it wasn't as terrible as we had feared. The emotional turmoil I had been carrying felt lighter now, though not gone entirely. In some ways, I was still lost, but in other ways, I felt freer than I had in a long time. For once, I wasn't carrying the burden of unspoken feelings. In a strange way, what had transpired between us had given me a new sense of freedom to face what came next, whatever it might be. As I walked away, the sting of uncertainty lingered, but so did something else, something softer, something hopeful. I wasn't sure where this path would lead, or if it would lead anywhere at all, but I knew I couldn't regret what had happened. Not for a moment. The emotions were too real, too intense to dismiss. I wasn't sure if we were at peace, but I felt a shift within me, a sense of acceptance, and perhaps, just maybe, a glimmer of hope for what might come next.